Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's class on global supply chain risk management. I hope all of you are doing very well. So, right now, we are in the midst of dealing with the coronavirus globally. And pretty much, if you open the news channels, international or local, one of the biggest things that everybody is talking about is uh, supply chain management and also managing risk related to supply chain management. There are, for example, as the pandemic spreads, there are a lot of questions about how prepared various countries were to deal with such a situation. Were there actions that could have been done to prevent the types of crises that some countries have seen? Generally speaking, when there is risk involved, the timing of actions taken by organizations to a large extent determines the outcome of how they whether or not they're successful in dealing with the particular situation. Now, they say that any situation can be dealt with and made either an opportunity or a threat. And to a large extent, whether a situation becomes an opportunity for a company or an individual, or whether it becomes a threat for them, really is determined by how prepared they are. The amount of background work that has been put in prior in the past really to a very large extent determines whether or not they will effectively be able to manage any random situation that comes their way. So, following the whole 9/11 in the United States, there was a big shift in the way companies began looking at global supply chain risk management. And they really understood that it's not a smart idea to wait for a situation to happen and do firefighting. Rather, it's a lot more wise and it's a lot beneficial to any company to do the planning for disasters or crises well in advance, so that when a situation actually happens, they can effectively be managed. If you look at various banks on Wall Street during in the aftermath of 9/11, there were certain banks that were able to, even though they were badly affected by 9/11, they were up and running within a couple of hours. And then there were other companies that were out for several weeks because they were not prepared. And so, as you can imagine, companies that were up and running were able to maintain their profitability, but the ones that weren't prepared and had to be out of the market for several weeks, effectively that could really lead to them being completely wiped out. So risk management is something that, at least in first world countries, has become a huge priority. Now, that being said, it is important to understand that yes, there are certain, huge events that can happen that even if a company is prepared, they may be unable to completely deal with them, with the situation that comes their way in the most in a good way. But there is a higher probability that they will be able to deal with it in a good way if they are prepared. So that being said, in this particular class in global supply chain, we've been looking at how the world has been changing. And in when I started off the class, one of the first topics I started off with was globalization. And with globalization, there are a lot more complex supply chains and longer lead times. And this also adds pressure on prices. I was just watching CNN right now, and just to give you an example, and in the United States right now, the coronavirus is spreading, specifically in New York City, very rapidly. And one of the key political people in New York City was talking about how they needed ventilators and they've run out of ventilators. and that they they have ordered those ventilators from China, and that it's going to take them up to 2 weeks to get those ventilators. And even then, they had placed an order for 17,000, but because of global demand, they were only going to be able to get 2,500 ventilators. So that just goes to show you that, even in a time of crisis, it's just the way the supply chains around the world have become are so complex that, just for the goods to sort of, and the 2 weeks they were talking about this, the 2 weeks it's taking for the ventilators to reach them is because of the high demand, but also, it takes time for things to get from one, across the globe. So with this increased globalization, there have been, for any product being made, there may be, various supplies may be being procured from one place or several countries. The manufacturing may be being done in a different place, and the final sales are being done in a different place. So obviously, there's a whole lot more complexity, and this creates risk because with when you're dealing with import and export and things traveling from one place to another, there is definitely more complexity, and with that, more risk involved. And also, there is, a pressure on, cutting down costs that has been is prevalent. So wherever people get the lowest cost, they gravitate towards those countries for manufacturing specifically. So that's one big trend that, if we want to understand global risk, and, we need to understand what is going on and what are the various trends that are currently happening in the world that are affecting risk in supply chain management. And right on top of the list, as I just went through, is, the increased globalization. And with that, the complexity in the supply chain. The other interesting thing or trend that has come up that has been affecting risk, global supply chain management risk, is outsourcing of non-core activities. So previously, most things were being done in-house by companies, and they would, end to end, they would look at making a product right from the, procurement of all the supplies all the way till the point that it actually reached, and the customer. All the different steps were being managed by companies themselves. But nowadays, one of the big trends is outsourcing various activities to third parties and only focusing on the core activities. And so basically, you outsource anything that you don't have any specialization in. Now, this is something that from a cost point of view and from an efficiency point of view, it is good. But the problem with this is that companies become heavily reliant on the third parties that they outsource to or that they're working with. And so this has, again, an effect on the amount of overall risk that the company is facing. And just to wrap that up, I just want to give a quick example. I mean, if there's a company that has outsourced one of their key functions to a third party, and for some reason the third party collapses, then in that case, their product or their service could be adversely impacted. The third global risk trend, sorry, that is affecting global risk is reduced cycle time. And so nowadays, everything is, there's a push to get things ready and, in the hands of consumers as soon as possible, especially with online shopping. From the minute somebody clicks a button and says they want a product to the point that it actually reaches them, every company is looking to cut the total amount of time it takes. And so even in the manufacturing, there's, things have to be done extremely quickly, and it has to be done correctly. So one thing with all of this complexity and with this additional emphasis on reduced cycle time, what's happening is that there's a lot more emphasis on sharing information across the supply chain. And so it's important, for example, what's happening is that now across the supply chain, various parties within the supply chain are no longer working in silos. They have a more collaborative approach, and they share information about what's going on. If there is a situation where they may, feel that they are close to running out of supplies, and they will make sure that they will inform everybody across the supply chain so that the demand planning could be done accordingly. And similarly, if there's a situation where there is potentially going to be a spike in the demand, then and the entire supply chain will immediately be informed. And so there's more transparency and more information sharing that's happening across the supply chain. And this is also because, as we mentioned, the supply chains are getting a lot more complex and there are more parties involved. So for the supply chain to be effective and efficient, this is extremely important. Another trend is using state-of-art technology. And this is something that is happening in a big way. Last couple of years, there's been new technology, and it's continuing to evolve. There's robotics that has been brought into a lot of, companies. There's a lot of technology. With that, there, there's the robotics and the all of this new technology and machinery is all really, really great, and it definitely improves efficiency. But one thing that does happen, which is a little bit negative, is that it reduces the level of amount of flexibility that companies have. And so that reduced level of flexibility also has an impact on the amount of global risk. Another very interesting trend that has been, increasing all over the world is mass customization. And this basically what this basically means is that customers are wanting customized goods. And so there's, even if there is a mass production of goods, each one of the goods is being customized at the end of, to make according to the customer's specifications. For example, in one of the case studies we did, I discussed Dell. And so something that Dell was doing was that they would make a computer, it would be ready in their factory, but they would ask the customer, what color compute laptop they would like. And so the outside shell of the computer would be made customized and made according to the customer's preferences. And so this customization basically requires a lot of coordination of distribution, handling, packaging, transportation of multiple products around the supply chain. And this has become a very big global challenge. And so this is also something that is a new marketplace trend. Moving forward, one of the other interesting global trends that is definitely been increasing is something that is around this whole sustainability issue globally. And what I mean is that there is a lot more emphasis on recycling and reuse of products. And the reason that there is a lot more emphasis is that, the world as we see it today, there's global warming, there are all kinds of environmental concerns that people have. And so companies are more and more interested in trying to learn how to recycle and reuse products. And there are also in many countries regulations that are coming out. And so if people are not mindful of the environment and they don't use sustainable practices, then there may be moral and legal ramifications. And also this will lead to bad publicity and disruptions in the supply chain. Some other things that are happening nowadays in the marketplace is that things before used to be made in very large lots. So there would be a huge lot of one type of a design that is made. But nowadays customers are demanding a lot more customization. And so production lots, or the amount that's being produced of one particular design, is being restricted. So there may be, people want a lot more variety. And so this is changing the entire nature of marketplaces. Finally, another important market trend that is impacting global risk is a lot of pressure to reduce costs. And so all around, there is this idea that people want quality goods, they want, customized goods, they want things that are, trendy and innovative and all of that, but they also want it at very, very low cost. And so this is puts all kinds of, so companies have to cut corners from everywhere and try and figure out, how they can provide products at ridiculously low prices that have good quality. This actually leads to a lot more risk exposure. Sometimes companies have to take certain calculated risks because they have to try to continuously reduce prices. And this is a big challenge. Also, sometimes the it it really becomes very hard to develop relationships. So let me give you an example of this. There have been certain very high-end brands which have in the past made have decided to work with factories in third world developing countries, and in certain situations those factories, for example, maybe be using child labor, or they may not be very safe. There may be certain fires that have happened in those factories that and people have been burnt down alive. And so these kind of things, when they these are very risky kind of deals that companies get into, but they agree to do this because they're trying to cut costs. So this becomes, if they are able to, in certain cases, cut down their costs, but then they're taking on a whole lot of risk. Also, it becomes very difficult when you are trying to cut costs, and that's your main objective, to develop long-term relationships with your suppliers, because your main objective in many cases is just who's providing the lowest cost. So these kind of things, these are some of the trends. They're very interesting trends. These are trends that are really changing the world as we see it, and they have been having and are having a tremendous impact on the supply chains of all companies around the world. Sooner or later, pretty much every company in the world is and has been looking at evolving and developing their own supply chains in according to these evolving marketplace trends. All right, so now, there are all these different types of crazy things happening in the world. Unfortunately, right now, we're seeing a global pandemic. Sometimes, we hear about nowadays, the kinds of things we hear about are, all kinds of climate related disasters. We've been hearing a lot of those over the last several years. Cybercrime and cyber wars, something which is a high risk, and a lot of people have been talking about that. So there are quite a few things that have been that are known to be big risks, and I'm just going to go through a couple of these. And I'm sure you'll recognize these because we all hear about them. And so as I go through these, this should just give you an idea of the kinds of global risks that, or the categories of global risks that companies all around the world are facing right now. So the first one is unstable geopolitical climates. And by this, what we mean is, there may be a lot of strikes, there may be political problems in countries. And because of this, it may be very difficult for companies to be able to operate. We've seen in the past, dharnas and various strikes that happen that cause a lot of problems for companies. Insecure supply chains. And so by this, what I mean is, man-made and natural disasters. And here, there are the natural disasters. I mean, there are earthquakes, there could be floods, there could be all kinds of, the pandemic that we're seeing right now. A lot of people are saying that this is some sort of a natural disaster, even though others are saying it's a man-made disaster. So who knows? But We all hear about natural disasters quite frequently in the news. Man-made disasters would be, wars, for example, or terrorist attacks of any sort. So these are, these obviously, both of these kinds of disasters make supply chains very insecure. And so this adds to the riskiness of supply chains. Currency fluctuation, this is another risk category, and this is something that you hear about regularly on the news. Many times you hear about, the dollar to rupee currency fluctuation, for example, and this becomes this is a big, something that really adds to the riskiness of doing business, because if your currency devalues or becomes a lot more expensive either ways, it may have a very big impact on whether or not others are wanting to do business with you. And so the value of currencies, and this is something that we hear a lot about in finance, and there are ways to manage the currency fluctuations. And but let's say you're importing certain supplies, and all of a sudden your currency devalues, well, then you're going to have to, it becomes a lot more expensive for you to import those supplies. So so this is an example of how currency fluctuation can really add to the risks that companies are facing when they're managing their supply chains. There could be also local and regional economic changes. The EU, for example, the formation of the EU, or how Britain recently separated from the EU, is an example of local and regional economic changes. And this can have impact global supply chains. Logistics infrastructure, there are certain things such as electricity, the availability of the internet, warehouses, port facilities. All of these things are examples, again, of categories of global risk. Then there is the whole cultural, language, and legal differences. Again, the level of difficulty of doing business in different countries can impact and increase the amount of global risk. Documentation requirement and customs clearance. These are, again, things that, if there is, some countries require just a ridiculous amount of documentation and customs clearance, and this may become a big problem when doing business. And sometimes customs just holds goods for and being unduly strict, and these kind of things can have an adverse effect on global trade. Quality and traceability, again, being able to trace back. So sometimes there are situations where there may be certain problems in certain products, and the ability to trace them back is extremely important. And if you are unable to do that, that definitely adds to the level of global risk. Supplier financial solvency. So this is another important one. So as people are doing business, you're dealing with all kinds of various parties, and if one of them, it's very difficult for you to keep a tab on all of the suppliers, even though large companies do a very good job of doing this. But in case you are unable to do that for any reason, and all of a sudden one of your key suppliers goes bankrupt, this could lead to a big risk for you, because you will no longer be able to get supplies from them, and finding another supplier may take a long time, and this could have an adverse effect on your own production. So that really concludes the categories or the types of global risks that companies are facing nowadays. And it's important to sort of know about these. And I'm sure, as I just mentioned, none of these would be a very big surprise for you, because you hear about a lot of these things. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about something that is extremely interesting, and perhaps this is something that, all companies should be doing, and it is also something that can only, help companies if they actually do it. For me, I was involved personally in business continuity crisis management and disaster recovery for several years in New York City. And I've seen companies invest heavily in this particular area of business continuity, crisis management, and disaster recovery. And the reason is that they recognize that it's almost like an insurance policy. And if you continuously prepare and you continuously invest in planning, or then when there's an actual disaster, you will be prepared and you will be able to survive it, and you will be able to do extremely well and hopefully come out a winner. So, just to give you a quick synopsis in the world of business continuity, and we'll, as we get into the further into the lecture, we'll be talking a little bit more about it, is, the whole idea of making plans for each specific department about if there is a crisis happens, or there's some inevitable event, then what is your contingency plan? What is your backup plan so that you can continue your critical operations? So anyways, like I said, I'll get into that a little bit more as we get along. But on a very high level, if somebody asks you to create a supply chain risk management methodology, or basically they ask you to figure out how the company is supposed to do supply chain risk management, there are 4 important steps. The first step is to categorize risks. And in the slide before, these are some of the key categories that I've discussed, but there may be a lot more. And so it's important to sort of make a list of all of the kinds of risks that can impact various companies' supply chains. So making this kind of very comprehensive list is the first step in a very important step. The next step is to do risk assessment and prioritization. And I'm going to be discussing each one of these in greater detail, so just bear with me. So anyways, the second step, I'll go into detail, but for now, is risk assessment and prioritization. And this basically means evaluation of implications of risk. So this means you try and figure out, okay, what is the probability of an event happening? And if it happens, is it high risk, low risk, medium? All right. The third step is risk mitigation. And here and we'll go into the details again for each one of these, but on a high level, you come up with a plan where you say that, look, if this X risk actually happens, if there is some sort of an event that actually happens that causes some sort of risk to this company, then we have a mitigation or a backup plan. And once we implement that backup plan, we will be safe and we will be able to continue our normal operations. And finally, the fourth step is monitoring and managing risk. And this means continuously checking and continuously managing situations that are high risk. All right, now for the next part of this lecture, I will be just basically going into further detail of each one of these 4 steps for managing supply chain risk. Okay, so the first one, categorization of risk. And so here what you want to do is you create broad categories of risks. And here they've just given you an example to start you off with. In 2 slides ago, these were just a whole bunch of categories of global risk in no particular order. But what they're saying here in the risk categorization, which is the first step, is that you can, think of various risks that a company can face in 4 categories. The first one is operational risks. And this could include when your equipment fails, or there's a labor strike, or there's a quality issue. The next kind of risk is, natural disasters. Then there's a category, that they've added here of terrorism or political instability. And finally, commercial or market risks. And this means, for example, sudden shifts in supply and demand. Now, these are just starting points that they've given. But it's really important to do brainstorming and to figure out in your particular company's case, what are the kinds of risks, make a comprehensive list. What are the kinds of risks that can have an impact on operations that are probable to happen? So if I was, for example, making a list of problems that could happen in Pakistan, I would definitely have natural disasters, definitely be looking at political instability. So each one of these four categories, I would probably be saying, you know what, yes, it makes a lot of sense. But maybe I would also add in another section here, another risk categorization, a pandemic, of a global pandemic. And and I would try to figure out a plan accordingly. So these are again just starting points, but you can add these and you should be able to come up with a very specific, comprehensive list of risks that you think would impact the company that you are working for. And that's the starting point. The next step is basically figuring out what is the probability of one of these risks that you had previously identified actually happening. And if it happens, what level of impact is it going to have on the organization? So for example, if there is, something, let's say, for example, in Pakistan, I'm looking at not natural disaster, and I think, you know what, there is a pretty high possibility of a natural disaster because, there've been a lot of trees cut down and climate change happening. So maybe, I wouldn't say it's a low probability. I wouldn't say it's a very high probability, but maybe, medium high, somewhere around here. Okay. Well, then from there, on the other axis is the severity, which means if a climate change event happens, let's say a flood, and so the exact scenario would be flood, then probability of flood happening in Karachi is probably right around here. And what kind of an impact would it have in Karachi? And I would probably say, well, pretty high, because what happens is Karachi streets aren't necessarily, and infrastructure isn't really prepared for, heavy rains and flooding. So, if it's, so somewhere right around here, meaning medium to high probability and, a pretty high severity. So, I would probably plot something right over here. And so this basically, according to this chart, means that I should be developing a contingency plan proactively for if something like this happens, which basically means I should plan that if a flooding happens in Karachi, how is my business going to continue working? Okay, let me take another example. And now I will say, okay, global pandemic. Now, until this pandemic came, it's very interesting. I would probably have not really thought that it's a highly probable event. But since a global pandemic, we've just gone through it and we've realized how, um, you know, what a severe impact it has. I would say that yes, okay, global pandemic could have, once Corona is figured out and once we have the, vaccine for it, hopefully soon, after that, we don't really see global pandemics happening very often. So I probably would say that, there isn't a very high probability that another global pandemic happen. I would probably, say a low to medium probability. And then if that particular, if I think like that, I would say, okay, so low to medium probability, but if it actually happens, it would have a severe impact on my company, because probably then I would have to, shut down the company. I wouldn't be able to continue um, operations. And so here, according to this particular chart, it's basically saying that in such a situation, I should build in flexibility in my company. And what that basically means is that, you know, if for example, my workers are no longer able to go to the head office or to the factory, then I try and think of other ways where I have backup, some sort of backup plan, some sort of flexibility where work could probably hopefully continue, you know, in spite of this. So maybe I would allow people, build a plan where people can work from home. And I wouldn't say that I'll wait for the disaster to happen and then I'll do it. No. In fact, for example, I would say, can everybody learn how to use Zoom, which we're using now, well in advance? So this would be an act of building in flexibility. And maybe I would train people on Zoom, and I would maybe ask my company to run a couple of meetings on Zoom, so that everybody knows how to use this technology. And this is a way to build in flexibility. Also, okay, so now let me give you an example of another situation, which is another example. Let's think about it. So let's see. Okay, let's see. Okay, so let's say that all of a sudden there is a power outage of some sort. Okay, in that particular situation, because we're living in Karachi, there is a relatively high probability of an electrical outage happening. But I think that if there is some sort of an electrical outage, the amount of impact it would have on my company, I would say, is not very high, not even medium, somewhere in the low range. And so what I would do according to this chart is I should probably have a risk mitigation strategy. I should probably have a generator, a permanent kind of a, you know, situation where a backup plan. So that's an example of, you know, there's a high probability of something happening, not that much of an impact, but because it's high probability and it's going to be, you know, happening again and again, I would probably want to invest in a generator so that I can manage that on a regular basis. And then, okay, you know, there is some sort of, let's say, another example, some sort of worker strike that happens. This is generally because in Pakistan, we don't have a lot of labor unions. The probability of a labor strike happening is pretty low. So I would say, okay, it's a low probability. And if that labor strike does happen, then the severity of that, you know, I don't think would be extremely high. Probably the workers, they also, you know, need the money on a regular basis, and many of them have, you know, they earn daily wages. So I would say the severity would be low because probably such a strike wouldn't last very long. And so this is something I wouldn't really worry about. I don't need to necessarily make a huge plan or make some sort of an investment. Instead, I would just, you know, manage this on a day-to-day basis. So you know, something like that I would plot over here. So again, I hope, you know, you've understood what, on a high level, what we're doing. The first step was identifying the most probable, you know, risky things that could impact the organization, and then plotting them out over here, which is a probability and severity mapping. And so, I would take each one of the risk scenarios that I identified in the first step, and I would just plot them on the probability and severity mapping, and that would give me an excellent idea of what I'm supposed to do in order to manage those risks that I think my company may face. Now, the thing is that if you end up, for the risks that end up over here in this category, develop contingency plans proactively. These are the risks that have a very high probability of happening, and they have a very severe impact on the company. For these, I need to develop contingency plans according to probability and severity mapping. And the question is, okay, well, you know, how do I go about developing these plans. And so the first thing is that, it really depends on the kind of situation, the kind of risk that you have identified. Generally speaking, though, there are certain backup plans that you can do. I gave an example right now of a situation where, maybe there's some political let me give you another example. There's some political, some sort of tension, and because of that, there's a complete shutdown all over the country. Well, in that case, again, as I mentioned, I would want to have a backup plan of work from home for my employees so that they can continue working, and that the company is able to continue, doing its critical operations. And I would test it out. I would not wait for the actual crisis happen and then I sort of test out whether or not my company can continue its critical operations. Um, around the crisis has happened. If it's a very, if for example, this political crisis, there's one particular city that it's highly probable and happening, maybe I would have an alternate office in another city. And I would, I'm just giving you an example of contingency planning, and I would ask my most critical staff to take a flight to the other city and work out of the other office till the political situation doesn't get resolved. And so this is an example of contingency planning. You're not waiting for the crisis to happen and then figuring out, okay, well, now the crisis has happened. Now what am I supposed to do? You are identifying what can most probably happen and what that would have a big effect on your company. And you are making a solution or alternative solution to how you will resolve that situation beforehand, and then you're testing out that plan. So it's not that, let's say, I want my key people to work out of, the Lahore office. If there is a crisis in Karachi, well, I wouldn't wait for the crisis and then send them to Lahore. I would send them to Lahore, ask them to manage the critical functions so that I know that, yes, this is a good plan. It can be executed. It has been executed. And next time around, when an actual situation happens, I can actually use this contingency plan. So that's an example of, contingency planning. Another important thing to mention is about managing currency fluctuations. Now, this happens many times. As I mentioned earlier in this lecture, there's a lot of emphasis on low prices. And so if the currency fluctuates a lot, and let's say there's a certain, on a certain day, there is an agreement that is made with a foreign country based on the exchange rate, and then all of a sudden the exchange rate has a huge fluctuation. Well, then, the final buyer may no longer be interested because the value of the goods or the price of the goods may be a lot more than what they had initially negotiated. So the best way to manage this is to hedge your currency. And so there are various hedging instruments that can be used where you basically say, you lock in to the exchange rate. And also you can have these kind of, you can have a currency fluctuation clause in your contract. And so you don't wait for a situation where the currency fluctuates a lot and then try and figure out and get disappointed if your customer leaves and in the middle of a business transaction. So you want to make sure that you hedge your currency when needed. You make some sort of clauses. You have these kind of discussions with companies beforehand. All right, another good way to do contingency planning, important thing to do is your rigorous supplier evaluation and selection process. The people that you work with, you should be doing a lot of due diligence on them. You should not randomly pick up. I mean, yes, cost is, we've discussed this, that cost is something that most companies are looking to reduce, but that should not be the only criteria that you are judging your suppliers on. Some key criteria to use when you are evaluating suppliers and selecting them include location, culture, language, differences, infrastructure and assets, working conditions, management capabilities, employee capabilities, cost structure, quality capabilities, process and technological capabilities, environmental regulation compliance, financial stability, IT capability, and suppliers and supplier network. And so you definitely, you want to work with countries that you know that, for example, if you've given an order to get something manufactured in a factory, you definitely want to make sure that it's not in a country that's going to have serious logistical problems, and not be able to deliver when needed. So you want to make sure that when you are working with companies, and it could be that somebody's placed an order with you, and so you just want to make sure that you check people out, especially when you start, and you do your due diligence, especially when you're starting out your business. And even when you're established, you do not want to take any sort of uncalculated risk. And the best thing to do is to rigorously assess your business partners, your suppliers, have a very robust selection process, and continuously keep checking on your suppliers. Even if you have made an agreement with them, keep on checking how they're doing, how their company is doing. Are they going through any problems? Because the way global supply chains are nowadays is that even if one company, even one supplier across your supply chain has any issues, it could have a very severe impact on your company's performance. Another important thing, or way that people are doing contingency nowadays, is development of suppliers. And so what we mean by this is that previously, in several years ago, suppliers were looked at as the anti-party. I mean, you were looking at a supplier to see how much you can squeeze them, how can you increase your own profit and reduce your total costs. And so there was almost this rivalry between suppliers and and companies. And nowadays it's changing quite a lot, where companies are realizing that these are actually your business partners, and if a supplier is doing well, then you will do well. And many companies are now developing and helping their suppliers. So it's a very different way of viewing suppliers. So this is something that also is a way of contingency planning for risk. Another important thing that companies are doing is third-party data services and data repositories. So a lot of the information that companies have is very sensitive. Many times all the data that they have is stored on a primary server. And companies are very nervous that if something happens to their main primary server, which is, it's a physical sort of like a big box, where a lot of the hardware and all of the software and all of that is stored. If anything happens to that, if it's blown up or anything of the kind, then they will lose all their data. So what companies do many times is that they can go on cloud and store their services on cloud, but sometimes companies are not interested in doing that because of privacy concerns. So what companies can do to mitigate this risk is that they can actually give their backup data to a third party, who can then hold on to their critical data. And in case, for some reason their primary server is inaccessible, or is non-functional, or something happens, then they can use that backup data and that data repository that they've stored at a third party to get up and running. Another way to really reduce your risk and mitigate your risk and do contingency planning is using contracts. And so developing, there's a lot of, in business, there's a lot of talk, and there's a lot of, nice conversations that happen in meetings. But what the best way to protect yourself and to protect the other party as well is to really have everything written down, and have everything, use contracts and use them extensively, and and have a lot of clauses and everything. Do not leave anything to imagination or just to hoping for the best. In fact, you should be able to identify all of your expectations, everything that you're planning to deliver with timelines, include quality issues, what your expectations are, and all of that. So the contracts are a great way to reduce risk all throughout the supply chain. Finally, if aligning technology roadmaps with suppliers, if you are planning to really bring in new technology, change the way you're doing your processes, anything along those lines, it's very important to share those plans or those roadmaps with suppliers, because they in effect are your partners, and they will once they have that information, they can plan accordingly as well. And so again, it comes down to really looking at your suppliers more as a as a party, rather than an anti-party. All right, so that brings me to the end of this lecture, and I hope you have had a good understanding of what global risks there are nowadays. What are the general categories, and if you were asked or tasked reducing the overall global supply chain risk for a company, what your methodology will be. Please be aware that I will be asking you to apply this in various situations. So I will be probably giving you a quiz on developing a global supply chain risk plan for a company, so that you get an opportunity not only to learn this from a theoretical point of view, but to also apply it. Thank you very much.